Well, our special guest, Scott Ellsworth, was suggested to us by a friend of the pod, Sam Vall, after listening to Jared's History with Rod segment on Magellan, the book review a couple of weeks ago. Sam, he's read three of your books, Scott, and he said they're all great. So we want to bring you in now, acclaimed author, historian, Scott Ellsworth. Welcome to the podcast, Scott. We really appreciate the time.
Thanks so much. It's a delight to be with y'all.
Well, it's great timing for us as America continues to celebrate 250 years. You're going to be at the Corunna Library on July 21st to talk about your book, Midnight on the Potomac, the last year of the Civil War, the Lincoln assassination, and the rebirth of America. Now, what it kind of intrigues me is there's conspiracies, there's spies, there's secret agents. Oh boy, I'm in. So tell us how you got into that topic for this current book.
Oh gosh, I could talk for 15 minutes. I'll try not to.
You got the time.
Well, one reason there are a couple of reasons. One was that our country right now is divided, and we've never been so divided in my lifetime. And I'm old enough to, as a young teenager, kind of remember the late 60s, early 70s, but it's worse now. And so when I was looking for a subject for a new book, I thought, well, when was the last time we were so divided? And it's, of course, during the Civil War era. And then I started to dip my feet into some subjects there, and I ran across a couple of really good stories. And I realized there was a larger book here that also might speak to Americans today about how we've had to deal with horrible divisions in our past, about the sacrifices that our ancestors made to help keep our country together. And I thought it was a good message to send to people today, to remind them that as bad as things can be now, we've gone through a lot worse before.
It's kind of unique. I was reading the excerpt about your book, how, basically it sounds like basically John Wilkes Booth did not act alone. How did you stumble across this information that maybe there's like kind of a Confederate secret service going on, where I'm reading that you're talking about they potentially tried to spread smallpox and set buildings on fire, derailed trains, stuff like that. How did you stumble across that piece of history or info? I've never heard that before.
So, I had no plan about writing about Booth, and I'm not a conspiracy theory type of guy. But, when I started looking at the period, I learned very quickly that the last year of the war was really important. And everybody thinks that after Gettysburg, it was just a mopping up operation. That's not true. I mean, we almost lost the country as we knew it in those last 12 months. But I said, well, that whole Booth-Lincoln assassination didn't make a lot of sense. And so I started digging into it, and I discovered thank goodness that the Civil War has never been the sole property of college professors. There's always been, dedicated amateurs out there, just regular people who become obsessed or enthralled by a battle, a leader, a soldier, a gun, or whatever, and they become the world's expert on it. And there was a guy who became the world's expert on John Wilkes Booth, and over the decades, he put together this incredible chronology of Booth's life, like every day where Booth was and what he was doing, and he had all the sources for it, and it was posthumously, published, called John Wilkes Booth Day by Day. But as I was reading through it, I realized that the version of Booth that I was taught as a kid, incidentally at Robert E. Lee Elementary School in Tulsa, Oklahoma, but it's the version you all were taught too, wherever you grew up, was wrong. And that version was that Booth was this kind of pathetic, second-rate, second-class actor living in the shadow of his far more famous father and brother actors, that he was just sort of an emotional, this loser, kind of a archetype of a John Hinckley or Lee Harvey Oswald. But as I read through this book, I realized that isn't Booth at all. He was a rock star of the American stage. He sold out theaters across the country. Hundreds are turned away from his performances. And once I realized we got the personality of him so wrong, then I started digging into it. And this was work done by others before me, realized all of his connections to the Confederate Secret Service. So that's how that book came together, initially.
Mm-hmm.
No, that's really interesting. And I mean, we all, even though Jared has his history segment, like Ted mentioned when he started this interview off, I think we all have a different degree of interest in history, especially our country's history. We've talked about a bunch of different topics, and you obviously, looking at your bibliography, it seems that you have an interest in history as well. the three of us are big sports fans is also, and one of your biggest books is the Secret Game, where it's I don't want to not do your book justice, but the Cliff Notes version is you talk about a game in the 40s down near where I'm at in Durham,
Right.
North Carolina, where it's kind of a game that kind of sparked a civil rights movement in a sense, and it kind of led into that sort of thing. The question I'm trying to get to is, how have you seen through your research and interest in history and your life as an author, the race issues cross over into sports? And do you have an interest in writing that sort of thing?
Oh yeah, I mean, and I lived it too. So I was born 2 months before the Brown decision, which allegedly desegregated America's public schools. Despite that, I didn't have a black classmate until I was in high school. So in my hometown, they managed to keep the schools separate. And in my high school, we had in the 10th grade, my high school was 10th, 11th, and 12th in Tulsa, Oklahoma. It was very well integrated, large, decent sized African American population, a lot of white kids, indigenous Native Americans as well. But we had horrible race riots my 10th grade year, to the point that we were on Walter Cronkite and CBS News. But the next year, our basketball team, which was all 5 starters were African American, we took state. And
wow.
What happened is the team really brought our school together. So I saw how race can be so important. And in fact, if you want to really be honest about it, I think it's in high school gymnasiums in particular, but also on football fields. That's where in much of the United States, that's where desegregation really sort of kind of worked its way out, where people had to get used to rooting for someone that they would normally have been conditioned to think is a bad person, somebody, whatever. And so I saw that personally. And then I go off to college. I was a basketball fan for a long time. Then I went to Duke for graduate school, and I caught the disease for which there is no cure, which is the ACC disease. So
Right.
I've been at that forever. And the genesis of the Secret Game was I was working as a Smithsonian historian at the Smithsonian, Washington, D.C. And I was thinking of a second book. I thought, what am I comfortable writing about? I'd already written one book on race. And I thought, well, what am I really passionate about? And it was basketball. And I knew that the basketball that existed before World War II was like a chess match. And in a thriller last night in Columbus, the Buckeyes nipped, the Wolverines 12-8. Well, by the 1960s, when I'm growing up, you've got this fast-paced acrobatic game, and I wanted to figure out why that change happened.
Okay.
And I knew race was a part of it, but I knew there was other things involved, and that eventually led me to this incredible forgotten. It's the first integrated college basketball game in the South, held in a locked gym on a Sunday morning, 10 years before anybody had ever heard of Rosa Parks or Martin Luther King. And it took a long time to get that story, but I knew it was a sports story that was important, but I also knew it was a larger story about the generation before the civil rights movement.
Interesting.
Sorry, I don't mean so talkative on this, but I'm trying to hit what you're asking.
No, that's really interesting, because we've talked about previous years just how sports obviously is entertainment, and a lot of us see sports as an escape from the real world, in a sense. But if we're being honest, a lot of the cultural issues do cross over into sports, and that's
Absolutely.
where a lot of statements have been made through sports, and maybe that's one that a lot of people don't know about. To be honest, I wasn't too aware of it until I feel like I had heard it about your book, but until I started really researching your bibliography, I didn't know a whole lot about that either. So it's a really interesting story.
Great, thanks so much.
Yeah, and I mean, your whole career, you've captured some very interesting things, including where you grew up in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and your very first book was based on a college thesis, wasn't it, Scott?
Yeah. So in my let me just say for your listeners, I've never written for other scholars. I write books for regular people. So don't just because I teach at the University of Michigan, don't read a lot into that in terms of how I write. But yeah, so in my hometown of Tulsa, Oklahoma, we had a skeleton in the closet.
Big
It's
time.
now known as the Tulsa Race Massacre, but it was the largest single incident of racial violence in all of American history. And over the course of about 12 hours in 1921, more than 1,000 African American homes and businesses were looted by white mobs and then burned to the ground. Uh, 30 square blocks were destroyed. 10,000 people were made homeless. We don't know to this day how many people died. Reasonable estimates would go from maybe 70 to maybe as many as 300, but we don't know. And the event itself was actively suppressed for 30 years. People had their lives threatened, wanting to write about it. So, I made it as my undergraduate thesis. And then when I was in graduate school, I was encouraged to turn it into a book. And so that book is called Death in a Promised Land. It's been in print since 1982. And then just a few years ago, I wrote a second book about how the massacre had been suppressed and then how we got the story out. Because I realized at that point I was probably one of the few people still alive who knew, how that all happened.
So you wrote that book in 1982 when you were in college. Then you took 33 years off until your next book. Is that
Yeah,
true?
it did. It took a long time. I did a lot of different stuff. I worked at the Smithsonian for 15 years. I did some work in film and in documentaries. Did a lot of public history, but it also I had to. There's a great difference between writing for a university press and writing for a New York publisher,
Right.
and it took a long time, really, to find that secret game story, and then to find enough people to be able to tell the story. But then I really had to train myself in a different way of writing. And there were other things that intervened: getting married, having kids, beating cancer, being broke, all that kind of stuff. So it took a long time. But
Yeah.
As you'll note, I've been cranking them out since then.
I want to know about. Go ahead, Jared.
Man, I just lost my train of thought a little bit.
I'll
Go ahead,
throw
Matt.
my question
Yeah.
out real quick. It's probably something that Jared maybe had on his list, because we've had a few other authors on the podcast before, and I always think this is an interesting one. Jared's usually the one that asks something along these lines. What's your writing process? Are you one that you go way up in northern Michigan up to the UP and get a lake house and seclude yourself for 3
I
months?
wish. No, I don't. My writing process is really just slugging it out. So here's the actual truth. I go into the office 7 days a week, and I'll go in on Sundays and Saturdays, and maybe it's just for 2 hours, but it might be a full day. I write in. This is what I look at all day, is I look at a blank wall because I don't want anything to distract me. But if you look out this window, which you won't be able to see, is the second largest university library in the United States.
Yeah.
Only Harvard's is bigger. And it's been this absolutely great resource for me. I just slug away and do it. Stephen King, perhaps the best-selling author in the world, he said that amateurs wait for inspiration. The rest of us just go to work. And that's the truth. You just have to keep slogging away, and maybe some days you'll write, 2,000 words, and other days you'll cross out 1,000 and go backwards. But here's the deal. If you write 300 words a day, that's one double space type page. Okay, here's Ted. Here's the question. What do you have at the end of the year?
You have 365 pages, right?
Yeah, you've got a book right there. So, it's just, a lot
Testing
of
the
the
old
work
guy.
is trying to find the stories and make sure the story is going to work. It probably took me 2 years to figure out how the Midnight in the Potomac story would work. And I remember the first time I suggested it to my literary agent, who incidentally is a Detroit native. He said, I don't know, somebody might buy this, but he was like, go back to work. And it took a while, but once I figured out the story and what I wanted to tell and how I wanted to tell it, then the writing went pretty fast. I wrote the thing in a year.
Do you just crunch it out, or do you lay out some sort of outline first and then fill it in?
Definitely have an outline. What I start with is I work on those big foam boards that like kids will do their science projects on, and I'll put Post-its on them, and I'll tend to organize them chronologically. But there'll be little scenes or little events and whatnot. And then I try to see what the connections are between things. I realize, oh, that could be a chapter and it could kind of end on this note. And then this could be a segue here to take me to the next chapter. So you see the thing pretty much where it's going to end up, before you start writing, at least in my case.
Let's bring it back full circle here to the book you're going to be talking about at the Corunna Library, The Midnight on the I can't say it.
Potomac.
There you go, Potomac. Help me out. Some of the key stories in there, I thought it was very interesting about Lois Adams. Tell us a little bit about that.
Lois Adams is absolutely remarkable. She was a widow, a single mom from Michigan, who was, took over the family farm, but then she became the Washington correspondent for Detroit newspapers during the Civil War. And thank goodness there was a librarian, I can't remember her name, at Central Michigan University, who sort of tracked her down and realized, my gosh, these are just really great columns. And she put them together in a book that was published by, University of Michigan Press. And I stumbled onto it and I thought, she's the great unknown journalist of the American Civil War. And she really writes about things going on the ground in Washington, D.C. She writes about Black people, about white people, about women, about men. And and she really captures the mood of the North, during these last desperate months of the war. And boy, I just put her in as much as I could because her descriptions are just so beautiful and poetic. But she's a great forgotten Michigan author, and you'll read plenty about her in Midnight on the Potomac.
This is maybe I should know this. Ted didn't know how to pronounce it. I'm not sure I did either. Midnight on the Potomac. Where did that title come from, and what is it exactly?
Well, it sort of came through a couple of different things. There was a print from an 1860s newspaper that showed a bunch of Union sentries on the long bridge across the Potomac guarding it at night. And it's sort of a lithograph with moonlight. And I thought that was very pretty. But I also thought a little bit about, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. They have their clock, how many minutes it is until midnight, depending on how close the world is to get to nuclear war.
Right.
So I thought of that as a crisis, and Midnight on the Potomac, in that, a number of observers, including Lincoln's good friend Noah Brooks, said that the last months of of the summer of 1864 were the darkest times in the war for the loyal citizens of the country. And I thought that was a way that we're really passing through midnight in this book, through really, really dark times. And then you see the turning towards the light. So it was a poetic thing that I just thought would work. And, and boy, I got to hand it to, it takes a village to make a book, but the designers on this, it took a while, but boy, they just nailed that cover beautifully. And I tell you, they nailed it in a different way. Once somebody was looking at it that I didn't know, and she said, gosh, this looks like a thriller. And I'm like, exactly, that's the point. It's not some dull, dusty, dry history. This is something you can get into.
Well, I can't wait to actually read the book. I know you're going to be having some books with you at the Corunna Library on the 21st. You'll be there putting on a presentation, maybe filling in some of the blanks we haven't covered here. And, I'm sure our listeners will definitely come on out and check it out. So you'll have some books there for autographing and all that.
Yeah, I will, or rather a local bookstore will be selling books there, which is great. And, and I'll talk, look, I'm not going to bore the audience to death. I talk for about a half hour. I've got some good stories, and then we just open it up. And I've been speaking about the book for almost a year now. I've been in, I think, 15 different states, as well as across Michigan. And there's a lot of, people want to talk about the Civil War, and there's always a lot of good Q&A afterwards.
What'd you think of the Ken Burns doc?
Oh, I thought it was absolutely tremendous. It was, I don't know if he ever topped it. It was just that good. Yeah. And it was, I think it was the best, really, multi-part history presentation ever on American television, frankly. I thought it was fabulous.
I agree.
Do you think, this is maybe a tough question, but I just think about our lineage of presidents. It seems like, man, there's very few that we look back on fondly. with Abraham Lincoln and all you researched in kind of his last year, before he was assassinated, do you think if he hadn't have been assassinated and maybe he had another term that we would still look back on Abraham Lincoln the same way so fondly?
I would think so. I mean, we just, historians are awful at predicting, what ifs.
Right.
So I don't know what he would have done, but we have to remember that, Lincoln, Lincoln came out of nowhere. He wins the Republican nomination. He's scoffed at by the newspapers in the East who say this hick from the Midwest can't string two sentences together. He's got going anywhere. He turns out this brilliant campaigner, but Lincoln was determined to end slavery, but he had a problem. He had to keep the Union together while he's fighting to do that. And he is able to take the war from a war that was primarily about preserving the Union to a war that is going to be a war to set men free. And that's just absolute brilliance. But Jared, the book speaks to this too, or at least what I'm trying to do. We live in a very divided era, but we live in a pessimistic era. I mean, faith in our institutions, which are under attack, by the way, is at a very much of a low point. And I wanted to remind readers about just the heroism and the incredible sacrifice that loyal American citizens, men and women, black and white, immigrant and native born, all put out to save the Union. And, and there's a lot of that there. So we have a very proud history, and we need to remember that. We need to honor that. We need to talk about it, but we also need to be inspired by it as a way to, deal with the challenges we're facing right now.
Yep. And we do have some challenges for sure, but we'll get through it because we're America, right?
Absolutely.
Amen.
Yeah. Last one for me. I think we were about to let you sign off, but
that's all right. We even haven't talked about the Blue Devils, but that'll be another show.
As you can see,
around the NCAA tournament in the fall. So
yeah, maybe next March. We're all Michigan fans though, so I don't know how much we want to talk.
I taught 3 of the players on the national championship team.
Nice.
So, yeah, they're all great guys.
Nice. Well, that's good to hear that they were still attending class. We don't have to get too deep into anything else about their
basketball players. Are very good.
Yes. But I wanted to ask. We talked a lot. We don't have to get super deep into, maybe a back and forth political discussion about it. But we talked about the 250th celebration that just went on in DC, and is it kind of along the same lines as what Jared was maybe alluding to right now? Obviously, the division that you kind of were talking about too. It was a very interesting, is a good word to describe a celebration there. Ted was just in DC a couple of weeks ago, and he told us about it. How do you think, maybe kind of piggybacking off of Jared's question, will this be looked at maybe 10, 15, 20, 30 years from now? Do you think it'll be different than how it's being viewed right now, the whole 250th celebration in DC?
Well, we'll have to wait and see. I mean, I have one of my sons. We have, despite my youth, I'm the father of 24-year-old twin sons, and one of them lives in DC, and he went down to the National State Fair, and he said there was nobody there. I mean, like some of the state booths weren't even manned. Luckily, whoever ran the show in Michigan, they were giving stuff away. They had their act together, but very, very low key in the district. I'm old enough to remember the bicentennial, how robust that was, but not just robust from the government, which was under Richard Nixon, who was under attack, but also there was the People's Bicentennial Commission. On the other hand, I went with one of my sons to a neighborhood celebration of the 4th of July that I had not been to before. It was fantastic. I mean, you saw that night, you saw a lot of people in neighborhoods across the country celebrating our nation, celebrating our history and all of that. I think that was very strong. But what happened at the national level was very underwhelming.
Well, we'll leave it with that, Scott. I mean, we really appreciate you taking the time out and joining us. I look forward to, I'm going to sign up and go see you there at the
All right, I'm going to hold you to that, Ted.
I'll be there, man. The 21st starts at 6:00. Kudos to the branch manager, Kathy Cramner, for getting it organized.
Oh, she's fantastic.
Absolutely. And, I appreciate Sam, too, for putting us aware of this. This is a great conversation. Maybe down the road we can do it again, Scott.
That sounds great. And I love what y'all are doing. Keep it up.
All right. Awesome. Appreciate it.